major credit rating agency released a forecast warning that Canada could lose its AAA credit rating should the Carney Liberals implement the spending promised in their platform.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford has sent a letter to newly elected Prime Minister Mark Carney demanding federal funding for several major provincial projects.
The Alberta NDP has voted to split from its federal counterpart after its crushing defeat in the general election. Hello Canada, it's Tuesday, May 6th, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Cosmin, Dzsurdzsa.
And I'm Geoff Knight.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. Fitch Ratings has warned that Canada's coveted AAA credit rating may be at risk if Prime Minister Mark Carney's newly elected Liberal minority government follows through on its $130 billion platform. Carney, who replaced Justin Trudeau as Liberal leader in March, led the party to a narrow fourth consecutive election win last week. However, with only 168 seats, the Liberals are forming another tenuous minority government and must rely on opposition parties to pass legislation. Fitch estimates that if the Liberals deliver on all of their spending promises, Canada's general government deficits will rise to 3.1% of GDP in 2025 and 3.2% in 2026. Far above the pre-pandemic average. In contrast, the agency had projected deficits of 2.7% and 2.4% respectively with former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. The rating agency said these deficit levels, approaching those seen only during the 2008 recession and COVID-19 pandemic, risk pushing Canada's gross general government debt above 90% of GDP, nearly double the median for AA-rated peers. Currently, Canada holds an AA+ rating with Fitch. Other major credit rating agencies like S&P, Moody's, and DBRS have rated Canada with AAA. Federal deficits alone are set to hit $54.6 billion this year and $43.4 billion next year under the platform, up significantly from earlier forecasts. Jean-Philippe Fournier, former policy advisor to Quebec's Ministry of Finance, said, quote, "The current Liberal plan needs to be modified or it will put the financial viability of the federal government at risk." Yet the Liberals claim only partial offsets through new taxes and efficiency measures, many of which Fitch says rely on overly optimistic assumptions, including uncertain revenues from retaliatory tariffs and government productivity gains. In December, Fitch had projected a 1.1% deficit for 2025. Now, under the Carney agenda, it seeks a risk of deficits nearly triple that amount. In the same report, economic growth in Canada is forecast to slow to just 0.1% in 2025 and 0.5% in 2026. So, Geoff, throughout the election, we saw not only Carney and the Liberals, but the legacy media present Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, the former governor of the Bank of Canada, this World Economic Forum guy, as a economic genius or expert who has experience wading economies through troubling times. But how does this Fitch forecast contrast with the way Mark Carney was presented to the Canadian public during the election?
Yeah, Cosmin, the Fitch Ratings warning about Mark Carney's $130 billion spending plan paints a stark contrast to how Carney presented himself during the 2025 election as a competent economic expert. Carney, leveraging his background, campaigned heavily on his economic expertise, promising to split the federal budget into operating and capital segments and balance the operating budget within 3 years, while running deficits in the capital budget to catalyze investment. He positioned himself as a steady hand, telling Canadians in Charlottetown that his government would spend less and invest more, framing his $130 billion in new measures as a strategic response to a fundamental reordering of Canada's relationship with the US and the global economy. His pitch was rooted in technocratic credibility, suggesting he could navigate Canada through economic turbulence, particularly with US President Donald Trump's tariff threats looming. Fitch's forecast, however, undercuts this narrative with a grim outlook. The agency warned that Carney's platform would worsen Canada's fiscal position, projecting a 2025 general government deficit of 3.1% of GDP, rising to 3.2% in 2026, significantly higher than the 2.6% and 2.4% deficits they had previously anticipated for those years under Trudeau's trajectory. Fitch flagged that these increased structural deficits would pressure Canada's credit profile, despite the country's AA rating and economic stability offering some buffer. They also noted the uncertainty of Carney's minority government, suggesting that legislative compromises could further deviate from the platform's promises, which adds more risk. This forecast directly challenges Carney's image as a fiscal steward, highlighting the potential for his plan to balloon deficits and strain Canada's credit standing, which are outcomes that clash with the economic discipline he claimed to embody. While Carney sold himself as a pragmatic expert who could manage Canada's finances through a crisis, Fitch's analysis suggests that his approach might instead lead to greater economic vulnerability, casting doubt on the very expertise he centered his campaign around. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has penned a letter demanding further federal funding for several provincial resource and transit projects amid a still hot trade war with the U.S. The letter, sent Monday, urges newly elected Prime Minister Mark Carney to support several infrastructure projects flagged as a priority for Ford and his progressive conservative government. Ford noted 5 projects for which he wants further federal funding in partnership with Carney's Liberal government, including all-season roads and electricity transmission lines to Ontario's Ring of Fire to ensure an end-to-end made-in-Canada critical mineral supply chain. He also called for federal backing on nuclear energy infrastructure, a new northern seaport to bring Ontario goods to new markets, a controversial transit tunnel under Highway 401, and, quote, multiple new GO transit lines in the Greater Toronto Area. Many of Ford's requests echo previous appeals for Liberal government funding, or were outlined in Ford's 2025 Ontario election campaign. However, the request for a new northern seaport is new. Ford envisions a James Bay port that would, quote, serve as a gateway to our northern seas to bring Canadian resources to new markets, helping to diversify Canada's trade and reduce our reliance on the U.S. International ports fall under federal jurisdiction. Specific figures on the scope and costs of the James Bay port have yet to be released, but in comparison, the 2023 construction of the Iqaluit deep sea port cost Nunavut approximately $84.9 million. Ford has advocated for increased funding and partnership on most of these projects before the letter, including the Ring of Fire development, nuclear energy, infrastructure, and transit projects. Though operated by Metrolinx, which reports to the Ontario Ministry of Transportation, the federal government has a history of funding GO Transit projects. During the latest Ontario election in February, Ford pledged to increase transit options in the Golden Horseshoe region, in the GTA, and in Toronto. Opposition critics have criticized Ford's plan to build a driver and transit tunnel expressway under the 401. Detractors say the project could cost up to $100 billion, making it potentially the most expensive project in the provinces. Ford says that with the federal government's help, the tunnels could improve our economic competitiveness by acting as a shipping route. Dr. Shoshana Sachs, a University of Toronto associate professor in the school's Department of Civil and Mineral Engineering, estimated the tunnel could cost approximately $1 billion per kilometer. Though Ford's government hasn't released information on the length of the project, Sachs estimates it could cost taxpayers $55 billion. So, Cosmin, could Doug Ford's behavior during the campaign and attempts to throw shade at the federal Conservatives have been a way to gain favor with Carney to fund these projects?
Yeah, absolutely. And when you just look at these projects themselves, right, these are things that the Liberals, by and large, have already funded. So asking for more money on projects that already have funding agreements is just an extension of funding agreements. And one of the things we didn't discuss here is like the nuclear reactor stuff. Like several provinces have asked for funding for small nuclear reactor research and development, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. But there's already been a federal commitment to that. So to the Ontario government, if the Liberals have already committed to funding, extending that funding further and making a request clearly outlining these programs, which have already been green-lit by and large. A few haven't, like the Ring of Fire stuff and a couple others in that letter, but it's just an extension of that funding. And I'm not so sure that Pierre Poilievre would have agreed with Ford on all of these, in the sense I don't think he would have played nice with Ford just due to his behavior during the campaign. We know that Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre wants to develop the Ring of Fire. He made it one of his key campaign promises with regard to natural resource development. But I think Doug Ford pretty much hedged his bets in a way, knowing that, well, here are some things in my reelection platform when he went up to the ballot that I know the conservatives would fund, while I can play the other side with Mark Carney and appeal to him, knowing that federal funds will continue to flow to certain programs I want, and I can try to make a case for the new ones that I pledged in my reelection platform. Despite Alberta NDP leader Naheed Nenshi criticizing Alberta Premier Danielle Smith amid the province's growing separatist movement, he is now applauding a separation movement of his own. Alberta's new Democratic Party delegates have voted to allow its members to opt out of joining the federal NDP at Sunday's annual party convention in Edmonton. This comes as an attempt to distinguish the highly unpopular federal party from the provincial opposition party in public optics. NDP leader Naheed Nenshi shared remarks celebrating this action, saying, quote, "This is a great movement for the very, very many thousands and thousands of Albertans who really like what the Alberta NDP have to say, but don't necessarily agree with the federal party, and this now gives them that choice." Until now, Alberta NDP members were automatically signed up as federal NDP members, a practice Nenshi described as a political liability. The vote, which required two-thirds support, passed with only a small minority of delegates standing in opposition. In a crowd of more than 1,000, just 2 or 3 dozen expressed dissent. Nenshi dismissed those concerns. Nenshi said, quote, "It's saying to everyone, look, you're welcome here," adding that the Alberta NDP remains financially and politically independent. The move also signals a departure from the legacy of former leader Rachel Notley, who last year called the idea of separating from the federal party, quote, "short-sighted and superficial." Nenshi's broader mandate, however, appears solidified. In his first leadership review, Nenshi received 89.5% support from delegates, up from the 86% he received during last year's leadership contest. However, Elections Alberta cited the Alberta NDP for inflating membership numbers during Nenshi's leadership race. The Alberta NDP was treating donations as automatic membership renewals, which violated election rules. Premier Danielle Smith, speaking in the legislature ahead of the convention, said the vote reflects the Alberta NDP's attempt to distance itself from a, quote, "damaged brand," pointing to the federal NDP's losses in last Monday's federal election, where it dropped 17 seats and lost official party status. Nenshi rejected the characterization, accusing Smith of misrepresenting the move. Just to go more off of Danielle Smith's comments there, is this a rebranding project for the Alberta NDP, Geoff? Can Albertans actually expect that Naheed Nenshi's party will have any different values than the federal NDP instead of just a rebrand?
The NDP's decision to allow members to opt out of federal NDP membership, voted on at their annual convention in Edmonton, marks a clear rebranding effort under Naheed Nenshi's leadership. Nenshi himself framed the move as a way to broaden the party's appeal, saying, quote, "This is a great movement for the very, very many thousands and thousands of Albertans who really like what the Alberta NDP have to say, but don't necessarily agree with the federal party, and this now gives them that choice." The overwhelming support for the change, passing with only a small minority of the over 1,000 delegates dissenting, shows a strategic pivot to distance the provincial party from the federal NDP, which Premier Danielle Smith called a damaged brand after its recent federal election losses. This rebranding is further underscored by Nenshi's rejection of Smith's characterization and his emphasis on the Alberta NDP's financial and political independence, aiming to shed the perception of being tied to an unpopular federal entity. The move also breaks from Rachel Notley's legacy, who had dismissed separations as short-sighted and superficial, signaling a new direction under Nenshi, who enjoys strong support with an 89.5% approval rating in his first leadership review. However, whether Albertans can expect the Alberta NDP under Nenshi to have meaningfully different values from the federal NDP is less clear. The structural separation does allow the Alberta NDP to carve out a more Alberta-centric identity, particularly on issues like the oil and gas industry, which the federal NDP has often opposed. Their 2021 platform, for instance, criticized pipeline projects like Trans Mountain, a stance that doesn't sit well in Alberta. Nenshi's rhetoric about welcoming all Albertans and focusing on local priorities suggests a pragmatic shift, likely to better appeal to rural and resource-focused voters who have been wary of the federal NDP's environmental policies. Yet the Alberta NDP's core values remain progressive at heart, emphasizing social equity, healthcare, and education, much like the federal NDP. Nenchi's high approval rating indicates party members still align with these ideals, even if tailored to Alberta's context. So while the rebranding creates space for a more distinct provincial identity, Albertans shouldn't expect a fundamental departure from the federal NDP's progressive values, just a more localized, resource-friendly spin on them.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating and please leave a review.